listen closely, because history rarely tells the truth about how empires are saved. They will tell you that the Silverfang kingdom was secured by the edge of a broadsword and the signing of the Blackwood Treaty. They are lying. The kingdom was saved in the freezing mud of a forgotten courtyard by a woman who didn't even own the ragged boots on her feet. A king's legacy was hanging by a thread because his feral, 5-year-old heir was entirely untamable, a violent pup who drew the blood of every noblewoman who dared approach him, until he met the lowest creature in the castle. The year was 1342, and the winter that descended upon the Silverfang keep was brutal enough to snap the ancient pine trees surrounding the castle walls. Inside the fortress, the temperature was scarcely warmer, though the chill that permeated the great stone halls had little to do with the weather. It emanated from the throne. King Cedric of House Stirling was a man forged in the fires of war and cooled in the ice of grief. His reign was absolute, his alpha aura so suffocatingly heavy that mere humans and lesser wolves would drop to their knees when he entered a room. But for all his terrifying power, Cedric was failing in the one duty the council demanded of him. He could not control his heir. Down in the suffocating heat and grease of the castle kitchens, Nora knew nothing of high council politics, though she knew every detail of the gossip. Nora was an Omega. In the ancient hierarchy of the lycanthrope world, Omegas were meant to be the pacifiers, the nurturing heart of a pack. But in a kingdom that prized ruthlessness and martial strength, Omegas were viewed as weak, subservient breeders, or useless burdens. Nora, an orphan of a decimated border pack, had spent her entire adult life rubbing ash and sharp-smelling lavender into her skin to mask her sweet, honeyed scent. To the castle staff she was just Nora, a mute, clumsy human scullery maid who was given the hardest, most back-breaking labour. "Scrub the iron grate again, girl," barked Mildred, the head cook, a heavy-set beta woman who ruled the kitchens with a wooden spoon and a vicious temper. "And if you're late bringing up the wash-water to the eastern wing, I'll have your wages docked for a month." Nora kept her head down, her scarred hands plunging back into the scalding, lye-filled water. She didn't complain. Silence was survival. Suddenly, a horrific scream echoed down the stone corridor leading from the great hall, cutting through the clatter of pots and pans. The kitchen fell dead silent. "The boy again," muttered Thomas, a kitchen boy, crossing his arms to ward off a sudden chill. Upstairs, a disaster of political proportions was unfolding. Lord Reginald of the Eastern Territories had brought his daughter, Lady Gwendolen, to court. Gwendolen was a high-born beta, draped in silks from the southern trade routes and reeking of expensive rose perfumes. She was the council's latest attempt to force King Cedric to take a mate. The plan, as always, was to win the king's heart by winning over his son, little Leo. Leo was 5 years old, but he carried the trauma of a veteran. His mother, the late queen, had been assassinated when he was just an infant, dying with him clutched to her chest. Since that day, Leo had been a broken thing. He did not speak. He barely walked like a human child, preferring to crawl on all fours, snarling at shadows. He possessed a premature ability to shift, often trapping himself in the form of a silver-furred pup, feral and vicious. He had driven away 12 nannies, 3 tutors, and violently rejected every prospective bride the king entertained. Lady Gwendolen had knelt before the boy in the great hall, offering him a carved wooden knight, a forced, sickeningly sweet smile plastered on her face. "Come here, little prince," she had cooed, her hand reaching out to pat his messy dark hair. Leo's upper lip had curled back, exposing unnaturally sharp canines. He didn't see a maternal figure. He smelled the deceit, the ambition, and the sheer irritation beneath her perfume. When her hand touched his hair, Leo lunged. His teeth sank deep into the meat of Gwendolyn's palm. She shrieked, thrashing backward, blood splattering the priceless Myrish rugs. The great hall erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward but hesitated, terrified of hurting the royal heir. "Leo, enough!" roared King Cedric. His voice was a physical blow, an alpha command laced with pure dominance. The sonic force of it shattered the stained glass of the nearest window. The pup let go, hitting the stone floor on all fours. He didn't cower. He glared at his father, his silver eyes completely devoid of the innocence of a child. Then, with a frantic scramble of claws against the stone, Leo bolted out the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the labyrinth of the castle corridors. Cedric dragged a heavy hand down his face, the exhaustion of 5 long years settling deep into his bones. Lady Gwendolyn was sobbing on the floor, surrounded by healers. The alliance with the Eastern Territories was likely dead. "Lock down the keep," Cedric ordered his beta, Silas, his voice hollow. "Find my son, do not harm him. But find him before he freezes to death." Down in the scullery, Nora heard the heavy boots of the guard rushing past the kitchen doors. She wiped the sweat from her brow, feeling a strange, hollow ache in her chest. Her Omega instincts, suppressed for so long, flared painfully whenever she caught the distant, distressed scent of the young prince. She knew the smell of a motherless cub. It smelled like terror. 3 hours passed. The sun began its rapid descent behind the jagged peaks of the Dragon-Tooth Mountains, and the temperature plummeted further. The castle was in an uproar. Every servant, guard, and noble was tearing the keep apart, searching for the missing prince. Nora had been completely ignored in the chaos, which suited her perfectly. However, Cook Mildred, panicking about the ruined dinner service, thrust a woven basket into Nora's chest. "Go to the Godswood," Mildred ordered, her face flushed with stress. "The snow has buried the winter mint and the frost root. Dig it up. The healers need it for Lady Gwendolyn's hand, and I need it for the king's broth. Do not come back empty-handed, or I'll lock you in the courtyard overnight." Nora nodded silently. She wrapped her thin, moth-eaten wool shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders and slipped out the servants' door into the howling blizzard. The Godswood was an ancient, sprawling garden enclosed within the castle's outer walls. It was a place of towering, twisted weir oaks and dense, thorny briar patches. The snow was already up to Nora's knees, biting through her thin leather shoes with a vicious intensity. She trudged blindly into the thicket, dropping to her knees at the base of a massive oak to brush away the snow, her frozen fingers searching for the tough, wiry leaves of the frost root. The wind howled, a deafening roar that masked all other sounds, but Nora was a wolf, even if she lived as a human. Her ears twitched beneath her hood, a sound, faint, rhythmic, and devastatingly sad. It was a whimper. Nora froze. She abandoned her basket, pushing herself up and wading deeper into the treacherous briar patches. The thorns tore at her skirts and scratched her calves, but she pressed on, guided by an invisible, magnetic pull that settled deep in her lower abdomen, the primal instinct of the Omega, the biological imperative to protect the young. Deep within a hollow formed by the tangled, frozen roots of a dying oak, she found him. It was Leo. He was fully shifted into his pup form, a ball of shivering silver fur no larger than a winter fox. He was wedged tightly into the roots, trapped by a thick, thorny vine that had wrapped around his hind leg. The more he had struggled, the deeper the thorns had bitten. His fur was matted with dark, freezing blood. He was dying. The cold was putting him to sleep, his whimpers growing weaker by the second. Nora didn't think. The human facade she had maintained for 10 years shattered in an instant. She dropped to her knees in the snow, crawling into the cramped, icy hollow. As soon as her shadow fell over him, the pup's eyes snapped open. Even on the brink of death, the feral instinct remained. He bared his tiny, blood-stained teeth, emitting a surprisingly ferocious growl. He snapped at her, his jaws clamping down on the heavy wool of her sleeve, missing her flesh by an inch. Any other servant would have run screaming for the guards. Any noblewoman would have fainted. Nora did neither. She let out a low, thrumming sound from deep within her chest. It wasn't a human sound. It was an omega purr, a frequency designed by nature to soothe the nervous system of an alpha, a biological lullaby that spoke of safety, warmth, and utter devotion. The pup froze. His jaws remained locked on her sleeve, but his silver eyes widened. He had never heard that sound before. He had never smelled what he was smelling now. The harsh winter winds and the freezing snow had washed away the ash and lavender Nora used to mask her scent. Beneath the disguise, she smelled like sun-warmed milk, wild honeysuckle, and the safety of a deep den. She smelled like a mother. Slowly, deliberately, Nora reached out her bare, freezing hand. She didn't reach for his head, avoiding the dominant gesture that triggered his aggression. Instead, she laid her palm gently against his trembling flank. "Hush, little warrior," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse, soft and melodic. "I've got you. You are safe." She sent a wave of calm through her touch, utilizing the latent magic of her caste. The pup's growl hitched in his throat. The tension bled out of his rigid little body. Slowly, his jaws released her sleeve. He let out a pathetic, broken whine and pushed his cold, wet nose into the palm of her hand. Tears pricked Nora's eyes. She worked quickly, her numb fingers snapping the thorny vines that bound his leg. Once he was free, she didn't pick him up like a pet. She unclasped her ragged cloak, opened the bodice of her threadbare dress, and lifted the shivering pup directly against her bare chest, pressing his freezing body over her heart. She wrapped the cloak tightly around them both, creating a makeshift incubator of body heat. Almost immediately, the pup began to shift. The silver fur melted away, replaced by the pale, freezing skin of a 5-year-old human boy. He was terrifyingly thin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He buried his face into the crook of Nora's neck, his tiny, bloodied hands fisting in the fabric of her dress. He didn't bite. He didn't snarl. For the first time in his life, Prince Leo of the Silver Fang Kingdom wept like a normal child, his tears hot against Nora's freezing skin. She rocked him back and forth in the snow, humming an ancient wolf lullaby, completely unaware that she had just altered the course of history. "My king, we have checked the armory, the stables, and the lower crypts. He is nowhere." Beta Silas looked exhausted, his broad shoulders slumped beneath his heavy chainmail. The torches in the courtyard sputtered violently in the blizzard, casting long, frantic shadows against the stone walls. King Cedric stood by the heavy iron gates leading to the Godswood, his chest heaving. His alpha aura was a jagged, chaotic thing right now, lashing out in panic and despair. His son was out there, his only connection to his dead wife, the only light in his miserable, blood-soaked life, was freezing to death in the dark. "He went this way," Cedric snarled, his eyes flashing a luminous, terrifying gold. "I can smell his blood." Cedric shoved past his beta, ignoring the snow that accumulated on his royal velvet cloak. He stormed into the Godswood, a dozen elite royal guards heavily armed and marching in his wake. Lady Gwendolen, her hand heavily bandaged, and her face pale with a mix of pain and morbid curiosity, huddled in the archway, flanked by her father, Lord Reginald. The search party moved through the ancient trees, the light of their torches reflecting off the blinding white snow. Cedric was operating purely on instinct, his massive frame pushing through the thickest briar patches without flinching. Then the wind shifted, and Cedric stopped dead in his tracks. The scent hit him like a physical blow. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and utterly impossible. Beneath the metallic tang of his son's blood and the sharp bite of the winter air, there was a scent so sweet, so purely and perfectly omega, that it made the Alpha King's knees buckle for a fraction of a second. It was a scent that commanded protection, a scent that demanded devotion. "Swords down," Cedric commanded, his voice trembling slightly. "Stay back." He walked forward alone, parting a massive wall of snow-covered hemlock. There, beneath the roots of the ancient oak tree, was a scene that defied all logic. A woman in the rags of a scullery maid sat in the snow. She was entirely motionless, completely covered in a layer of frost, looking more like an ice sculpture than a living creature. But wrapped tightly inside her cloak, nestled securely against her chest, was Leo. The boy was asleep. His breathing was even and deep. He wasn't shivering. Cedric's heart slammed against his ribs. The relief was instantaneous and staggering, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, protective fury. A strange woman, a servant, was holding the royal heir, a woman who had been hiding a phenomenally powerful Omega scent within his own walls. To touch the royal family without permission was treason. To conceal one's lycanthrope nature from the king was a death sentence. Cedric stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. His shadow engulfed the pair. Nora slowly raised her head. Her lips were blue from the cold, her eyelashes caked in ice. She looked up at the towering, terrifying figure of the Alpha King. She saw the lethal intent in his golden eyes. She knew the law. She knew she was going to die right here in the snow. But as Cedric reached down to snatch his son away from her, Nora didn't cower. The Omega instinct overrode her fear of the Alpha. She tightened her arms around the boy, turning her body slightly to shield him from the sudden movement, letting out a low, warning hiss. Cedric froze, shocked by the sheer audacity of the creature. "Release my son, peasant," he growled, a sound that usually made grown men weep. "Release him, or I will take your hands from your wrists." The noise woke the boy. Leo shifted in Nora's arms. The guards behind Cedric tensed. Lady Gwendolen, peering through the branches, gasped. Everyone expected the feral prince to wake up violently, to attack the woman holding him, or to flee from his father's wrath. Leo blinked sleepily. He looked up at the massive, terrifying form of his father, then looked down at the freezing, ragged woman who was holding him. He felt her shivering. He felt her heart beating steadily beneath his ear. Slowly, the 5-year-old prince untangled himself from the cloak. He didn't drop to all fours. He didn't snarl. For the first time in his life, Leo stood upright on 2 feet, entirely human, entirely composed. He stepped directly between King Cedric and the scullery maid. He raised his small, blood-stained hands and placed them flat against his father's heavily armored chest, pushing back. The courtyard was so quiet that one could hear the snow falling. Leo looked his father dead in the eye, his silver gaze remarkably clear and filled with an ancient, stubborn defiance. He opened his mouth, using a voice he hadn't used in over 3 years. It was raspy, small, but entirely coherent. "No," the little prince commanded. "Leave my mom alone." The silence that followed was louder than an explosion. Behind them, Lord Reginald dropped his walking cane. Beta Silas stared with his mouth slightly open. Lady Gwendolen looked as though she had been slapped. King Cedric stared at his son, the word echoing in his mind like a war drum. Mom. It was a title that commanded the highest respect in Lycan culture, a title of absolute authority over a pup. It was not a word given lightly. It was a biological bond recognized by the very magic of their bloodlines. Cedric slowly lowered his gaze to the shivering woman still sitting in the snow. Her scent was swirling around him, unraveling his legendary control, seeping into the cracks of his broken heart. She was a peasant. She was an Omega. She was a liar. And according to the ancient laws of the pack, by the declaration of the royal heir, she was now the most important woman in the kingdom. The wind in the godswood seemed to hold its breath. King Cedric stared at the small, defiant boy, standing between him and the freezing scullery maid. The word Mom hung in the icy air, an unbreakable ancient pact recognized by the very magic thrumming in their lichen blood. In the rigid, brutal hierarchy of the Silverfang kingdom, a pup's claim was absolute. By lichen law, specifically the lex materna, recorded in the Harrington ledgers of 1320, a mother chosen by a royal heir could not be harmed, separated, or denied access to the child. To strike her was to strike the crown. Cedric's golden alpha eyes flickered between the boy's fiercely set jaw, and Nora's pale, terrified face. Her scent, wild honeysuckle and warm milk, was actively fighting a war against his legendary composure. Silas, Cedric's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the snow-laden branches. Take Lord Reginald and Lady Gwendolen back to the guest wing. Have the healers tend to her hand. They are confined to their quarters until I say otherwise. Outrageous! Lord Reginald spat, his face purple with indignation. You allow a peasant to usurp a high-born beta? A filthy kitchen rat? Cedric didn't even look at the man. He simply let a fraction of his alpha aura slip. The oppressive, suffocating pressure dropped Lord Reginald to his knees in the snow, gasping for air as if an invisible hand had wrapped around his throat. That kitchen rat, Cedric said softly, just commanded the respect of the future king, a feat your daughter failed to achieve with a wooden toy and a false smile. Remove them, Silas. As the guards dragged the protesting nobles away, Cedric turned his attention back to Nora. The adrenaline of the encounter was fading, and the brutal cold was taking its toll on her. Her eyes fluttered, rolling back as her body finally gave in to the freezing temperatures. She slumped sideways into the snow. "Mom!" Leo screamed, panic tearing through his small voice. He dropped to his knees, his tiny hands grabbing her icy cheeks. The feral edge returned to his eyes, his canines lengthening as he looked up at his father, ready to kill to protect her. Cedric moved faster than humanly possible. He bypassed his son entirely, sweeping Nora's limp, freezing body into his massive arms. She weighed practically nothing. Beneath her soaked, ragged wool dress, he could feel the sharp jut of her ribs. "I am not hurting her, Leo," Cedric said firmly, projecting a wave of protective alpha calm. "But if we do not get her to the fires, she will die. Come." For the first time in his life, Leo didn't run from his father. He grabbed the edge of Cedric's heavy velvet cloak and ran alongside him, as the Alpha King carried a muddy, unconscious scullery maid straight through the great hall, past the shocked gasps of the remaining courtiers, and up the grand staircase to the forbidden royal wing. When Nora finally awoke, she thought she had died and passed into the afterlife of the moon goddess. She was submerged to her shoulders in a massive copper tub filled with steaming water, infused with expensive oils of sandalwood and crushed pearls. The biting cold was gone, replaced by a deep, penetrating warmth. She gasped, thrashing backward against the rim of the tub. "Easy!" a deep voice commanded. Nora froze. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair near the roaring hearth was King Cedric. He had discarded his armor, wearing only a loose linen tunic and dark trousers. Without the crown and the steel, he looked less like a deity and more like a deeply exhausted, incredibly dangerous man. Sitting on the rug at his feet, playing quietly with a set of carved wooden horses, was Prince Leo. The moment he heard Nora splash, the boy scrambled up and ran to the edge of the tub, resting his chin on the warm copper, his silver eyes wide and adoring. Nora instinctively reached out a wet hand to cup his cheek, her omega nature soothing the anxiety radiating from the boy. Then, reality crashed down upon her. She was naked in the king's chambers. She had hidden her secondary gender. She was a criminal. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Nora whispered, instantly bowing her head, her wet hair falling over her face. "I meant no treason. I only wished to save the boy." Cedric leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze was piercing, analyzing every micro-expression on her face. "Your scent is unmasked. You are an Omega, a pure blood, if my senses do not deceive me. Yet you have scrubbed floors in my kitchens for 3 years, disguised as a human mute. Why?" Nora swallowed hard. "Because Omegas in the outer territories are not treated as pacifiers, my king. They are traded as breeding stock. When the Blackwood Raiders slaughtered my pack in 1332, I rubbed ash and lye into my skin to hide my scent, so I would be put to work in the labor camps, rather than sold to the brothels. When I escaped to Silverfang, the kitchens were the only place the smell of grease and burnt wood could hide what I was." Cedric's jaw tightened. The Blackwood massacre was a stain on the kingdom's history, a border dispute he had arrived too late to stop. "You endured the lie, the beatings of the cook, and the freezing stone, all to protect your autonomy," Cedric murmured, a strange edge of respect entering his voice. "And yet, you risked exposure and execution to save a feral pup that was not yours." "He was hurting," Nora said simply, looking at Leo. "A motherless cub knows no politics, Your Grace. He only knows the cold." Cedric stared at her. The women of his court, like Lady Genevieve of House Lancaster, his ambitious widowed sister-in-law, were consumed by status, silk, and power. This woman, scarred and starved, possessed a regal dignity that stripped him bare. "You are no longer a scullery maid," Cedric declared, standing up. His massive frame dominated the room. "By the decree of the Crown Prince, you are his mater concilium. You will reside in the royal wing. You will be clothed, fed, and protected by my elite guard." Nora's eyes widened in sheer panic. "My king, please! The court will tear me apart! The noblewomen—" "Let them try," Cedric interrupted, his golden eyes flashing with a possessive, dangerous light that made Nora's breath catch. "You belong to the crown now, Nora, and I protect what is mine." The transition was violent, not in blood, but in politics. Within a week, the castle was a hotbed of vicious whispers. The peasant mother had become the sole obsession of the Silverfang nobility. Nora was stripped of her rags and forced into heavy, suffocating gowns of emerald silk and velvet. The castle seamstresses had worked through the night, terrified of the king's wrath, to dress the Omega appropriately. But silk could not hide the calluses on her hands, nor the lingering timidity in her posture. Despite her fear, Nora thrived in one area. Leo, the feral, violent prince, had vanished. In his place was a quiet, intensely observant 5-year-old boy who refused to be further than 3 feet from Nora at any given time. He ate only if she prepared the plate. He slept only if she hummed the ancient lullabies of her fallen pack. He was healing, and the kingdom could see it. King Cedric saw it too. And much to the horror of the court, the Alpha King was spending an unprecedented amount of time in the nursery. It was during the winter solstice banquet that the brewing storm finally broke. The great hall was draped in crimson banners and lit by 1,000 beeswax candles. Every high-born lord and lady from the 4 territories was present. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Cedric sat at the head of the high table. To his right sat Beta Silas. To his left, an unprecedented breach of protocol, sat Nora, with little Leo tucked safely between them. From the lower tables, the glare of Lady Genevieve of House Lancaster was burning a hole through Nora's skull. Genevieve, a striking, sharp-featured alpha female, had spent the last 5 years positioning herself to be the king's next mate. She had the backing of Lord Alastair Harrington, the master of coin, and the silent support of half the council. To them, Nora was not a miracle. She was a disease infecting the royal bloodline. "She eats like a sparrow," Genevieve whispered, behind her jeweled fan to Lord Harrington. "Look at her trembling. The king is enchanted by a spell, I am sure of it. An Omega witch." "Patience, my lady," Harrington murmured smoothly, swirling his wine. Weeds that grow too fast in the royal gardens are easily uprooted. As the third course, roasted boar and honeyed root vegetables, was cleared, the royal cupbearer approached the high table. He carried a silver tray holding a small, jewelled goblet of warm, spiced milk, a special treat meant to help the young prince sleep through the loud festivities. Nora smiled softly as the cupbearer set the goblet down in front of Leo. The boy reached for it eagerly with both hands. But as the steam from the milk drifted upward, Nora's omega senses flared violently. Her acute sense of smell, honed by years of foraging in the wild to survive, caught a scent completely masked by the cinnamon and nutmeg. It was the faintest, sharpest metallic tang. Bitter almond, aconite, refined wolfsbane. To an adult alpha, a small dose would cause violent illness. To a 5-year-old pup, it was an agonizing, guaranteed death. Leo's lips parted, ready to drink. "No!" Nora screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was a guttural, terrifying roar of a mother protecting her young. Before the king or the guards could react, Nora threw herself across the heavy oak table. She struck the silver goblet with the back of her hand, sending it flying through the air. The goblet shattered against the stone floor, the spiced milk hissing and bubbling unnaturally as it ate through the varnish of the nearby wood. The great hall erupted into sheer chaos. Swords were drawn. Women shrieked. Nora had tackled Leo to the floor, covering his small body entirely with hers, her teeth bared, emitting a feral, echoing hiss at the cupbearer, who had frozen in absolute terror. Lady Genevieve stood up, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Nora. "Treason! The peasant has gone mad! She attacked the prince!" "Seize her!" Lord Harrington shouted to the guards. "She is unstable. She tried to harm the heir." 2 guards rushed forward, reaching down to grab Nora by her silk gown. Before their fingers could even graze the fabric, a sound ripped through the hall that paralyzed every living soul. It was an alpha roar of such devastating, world-ending fury that several of the weaker nobles instantly collapsed, blood dripping from their noses. King Cedric vaulted over the high table, landing in front of Nora and Leo. His human facade had completely dissolved. His eyes were burning gold, his claws fully extended, and his fangs bared. The royal cupbearer took one look at the king and wet himself, dropping to his knees and sobbing. Cedric didn't look at Genevieve. He didn't look at Harrington. He looked down at the bubbling, sizzling puddle of milk on the stone floor. The scent of wolfsbane was now unmistakable. Someone had just tried to assassinate his son. And the only reason his boy was still breathing was because the ragged Omega they all despised had thrown herself into the line of fire. Cedric slowly turned his head, his lethal gaze locking on to the terrified cupbearer. "Who?" the king whispered, his voice echoing like a death knell in the silent hall. "Gave you that cup?" The royal cupbearer, a young human boy named Peter, collapsed entirely, his knees striking the unforgiving stone. A dark stain spread across his breeches. He was trembling so violently his teeth chattered. I mercy, your grace," Peter sobbed, pressing his forehead against the floor. "I did not know what it was. I swear upon the moon goddess, I did not know." "Who?" Cedric repeated. The word was not a shout. It was a deadly, vibrating hum that rattled the silver platters on the tables. It was the sound of a predator cornering its prey. From the lower tables, Lady Genevieve stood up, her face a mask of pale, calculated outrage. "My king, do not listen to this snivelling wretch. The Omega Witch obviously hexed the cup herself to play the savior. She is trying to turn you against your own loyal court." "Silence!" The command tore from Beta Silas's throat. The king's second-in-command had already unsheathed his broadsword, stepping off the dais to flank the high table. Cedric slowly stepped over the bubbling puddle of poisoned milk. He reached down, his massive, clawed hand wrapping around the back of Peter's neck, hauling the boy up until they were eye to eye. Cedric's golden eyes were practically glowing in the dim hall. "Aconite is a lichen poison, boy," Cedric growled, his voice a lethal whisper. "A human would not possess it, nor know the dosage to kill a pup without killing a grown alpha. Give me a name, Peter. Give me the name, and your family will survive the night. Lie to me, and I will tear your throat out with my teeth." Peter choked on a sob, his terrified eyes darting wildly toward the lower tables. He looked directly at Lord Alistair Harrington. "Lord Harrington," Peter wailed, tears streaming down his face. "He gave me the powder. He said it was a sleeping draught for the prince. And Lady Genevieve, she promised my father a farm in the western valleys if I poured it." The great hall gasped as one collective entity. Lord Harrington's face twisted into an ugly snarl. The polished aristocratic veneer vanished, revealing the desperate, power-hungry creature beneath. Realizing the game was entirely lost, he didn't beg. He reached beneath his heavy velvet cloak and drew a concealed, silver-forged dagger, a treasonous weapon to bring into the king's presence. "The boy is a feral abomination," Harrington roared, lunging not at the king, but toward the dais where Nora was still using her body as a human shield over Leo. "And you, Cedric, are a weak, grieving fool, letting a kitchen rat dictate the future of Silverfang." Harrington was fast, fueled by the desperate adrenaline of a doomed man, but he was fighting a king born of war. Cedric didn't even draw his sword. He intercepted Harrington halfway to the dais. With a brutal, sickening crunch of bone, Cedric's fist connected with Harrington's jaw, shattering it instantly. Before the corrupt lord could even hit the floor, Cedric grabbed him by the throat and slammed him onto the heavy oak of the high table, the silver dagger clattering uselessly away. "Silas!" Cedric roared, his knee pressed into Harrington's chest, pinning the traitor down. "Arrest Genevieve of House Lancaster. Lock down the gates. Any guard loyal to Harrington is to be executed on sight," Genevieve shrieked as Silas's heavy, gauntleted hand clamped down on her shoulder. "You cannot do this. I am of House Lancaster. The council will rebel." "Let them!" Cedric snarled, his fangs bared, his chest heaving. "There is no council tonight, only the crown." As the guards swarmed the hall, dragging a screaming Genevieve and a bleeding, unconscious Harrington toward the dungeons, the terrifying chaos slowly began to recede. The remaining nobles were frozen in sheer terror, pressing themselves against the walls, averting their eyes from the Alpha King's wrath. Cedric slowly released his grip on the table. His hands were shaking, not from the fight, but from the horrifying realization of how close he had come to losing his son. He turned back to the dais. Nora was sitting up, her arms still wrapped fiercely around Leo. The little prince was clinging to her, his face buried in her neck, completely silent but unharmed. Nora, however, was pale. In her desperate dive across the table, she had struck the silver goblet hard enough to shatter it, and the jagged edge had sliced deep into the palm of her hand. Blood, rich, crimson, and carrying the unadulterated scent of her pure-blood Omega lineage, was dripping onto the stone floor. Cedric stepped toward her. As the scent of her blood hit his senses, something ancient and irrevocable snapped deep within the king's chest. The heavy iron walls he had built around his heart since his first wife's murder shattered into a million pieces. The biological imperative of the lycanthrope was a terrifying, beautiful thing. It bypassed logic, status, and politics. In that single moment, bathed in the candlelight and the scent of wild honeysuckle mixed with fresh blood, Cedric did not see a peasant. He did not see a servant. He saw his equal. He saw the missing half of his soul, the mate bond, dormant and thought dead forever, flared to life with the intensity of a dying star. Cedric dropped to his knees before her, uncaring of the blood or the poisoned milk staining his royal trousers. He reached out, his massive hands incredibly gentle as he took her bleeding hand in his. "You are hurt," Cedric whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of his alpha command. Nora looked up into his eyes. The terrifying feral king was gone. In his place was a man looking at her with such raw, unmasked devotion that it made her breath catch in her throat. "I am fine, my king," Nora murmured, her omega purr naturally rising in her throat to soothe his lingering distress. "The pup is safe. That is all that matters." "No," Cedric said, his thumb gently brushing the uninjured part of her wrist, feeling her erratic pulse. "That is not all that matters. Not anymore." The brutal, suffocating winter finally broke 3 weeks later, but the ice that shattered within the walls of the Silverfang Keep was not wrought by the changing of the seasons. It was the absolute, unyielding wrath of an Alpha King pushed to the very brink of losing his world. The executions of Lord Alastair Harrington and Lady Genevieve of House Lancaster were not quiet affairs relegated to the shadowy depths of the royal dungeons. King Cedric demanded a public spectacle in the central courtyard, beneath the pale, freezing morning sun. The message sent across the 4 territories was written in blood and bone. The Silverfang crown was untouchable, and the king's vengeance was reserved entirely for those who dared threaten his bloodline. When the heavy iron axe of the royal executioner fell, severing the heads of the traitors, a heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the gathered nobility. Duke Frederick of the Western Marches, a man who had silently supported Genevieve's bid for the throne, immediately dropped to his knees in the freezing mud, trembling as he swore absolute, unwavering fealty to the crown. The treacherous lords who had whispered in the shadows were systematically stripped of their ancestral lands, their wealth seized by the royal treasury, and their families banished to the barren, unforgiving northern wastes. The High Court, once a viper's nest of ambition and sabotage, was violently sanitized. In the aftermath of the bloodletting, a strange, unprecedented peace settled over the ancient stone corridors of the castle. The vicious, cutting whispers vanished, replaced by a cautious, deeply respectful reverence for the woman who now resided behind the heavily guarded oak doors of the royal wing. Nora's existence had transformed into a surreal, golden-hued dream, though the transition from a bruised, half-starved scullery maid to a woman of the High Court was not without its deep psychological scars. Her right hand healed slowly under the meticulous care of Maester Godwin, the castle's ancient, half-blind physician. The jagged cut from the poisoned silver goblet left a raised, pale, silvery scar slicing diagonally right across her palm. It was a permanent, physical reminder of the night she had thrown herself between death and the kingdom's future. Yet, despite her elevated status, Nora vehemently refused the trappings of typical high-born vanity. When the royal seamstresses arrived with bolts of suffocating, heavy, corseted silks and jewel-encrusted velvet gowns, Nora sent them away. She chose instead to wear simple, elegantly tailored dresses of soft, breathable wool, rich dyed linens in forest greens and deep indigos, and comfortable leather boots. She found solace, not in the glittering banquets of the great hall, but in the quiet, fire-lit routine she had painstakingly built with the young prince. The feral, violently untamable pup that had terrorized the castle was gone, buried beneath the snows of the Godswood. In his place, Prince Leo was blossoming into a thriving, intensely observant and brilliant boy. Under the guidance of Master Sullivan, the royal tutor, Leo was finally learning to read and write. However, the 5-year-old prince flatly refused to attend his daily lessons, unless Nora was sitting by the hearth in the very same room. He would often pause his recitations of ancient lichen history just to look over his shoulder, his bright silver eyes seeking her out. When Nora would offer him a warm, reassuring smile, the tension would melt from his small shoulders, and he would return to his parchment. He was healing, his fractured mind knitting itself back together through the sheer, unrelenting power of an Omega's devotion. But the most profound and terrifying change within the castle walls was the Alpha King himself. Cedric courted her with a fierce, quiet, and agonizingly patient intensity that thrilled and terrified Nora in equal measure. He did not issue booming royal decrees demanding her presence or her affection. He knew she was a survivor of extreme trauma, a wolf who had spent a decade hiding her true nature in the ash and grease of a kitchen. He approached her the way one might approach a magnificent, wounded wild bird. Instead of showering her with meaningless gold and jewels, Cedric brought her fragments of the world she had been denied. He brought her rare, winter-blooming frost lilies from the castle's glass houses. He gifted her a breathtaking, first-edition pressing of the Celestial Lexicon, knowing she had a secret, ravenous hunger for literature that she had nurtured by stealing glances at discarded servant ledgers. In the evenings, after the council meetings concluded and the castle grew quiet, Cedric would dismiss his personal guards. He would enter the nursery, stripping off his heavy armor and royal mantle, looking less like a warring monarch and more like a weary, deeply devoted man. He would sit beside Nora on the plush rugs before the roaring fire, his massive frame a comforting, immovable mountain of heat, and read aloud to Leo until the boy fell asleep, his head resting heavily against Nora's side. During these quiet, intimate hours, Cedric would ask her about her past. He listened with absolute, unbroken attention to her stories of the borderlands, of the pack she had lost to the Blackwood Raiders, of the mother who had taught her the ancient lullabies. And as he listened, Nora noticed the subtle, intoxicating shift in his scent. The sharp ozone and steel bite of his dominant alpha aura would soften, melting into the deep, grounding fragrance of rain-soaked pine and warm earth. It was a scent that whispered of safety, of a den built to withstand the end of the world. One crisp, blindingly bright afternoon in late February, as the very first stubborn signs of spring began to thaw the frozen earth, Cedric found Nora alone in the Godswood. She was standing silently beneath the massive, twisted branches of the ancient weir oak, the exact hollowed-out root system where she had found a freezing, dying silver pup all those months ago. She was reaching out, her scarred hand gently tracing the fragile, pale green buds, pushing their way fiercely through the lingering morning frost. It survived the winter. Cedric's deep, gravelly voice resonated through the quiet clearing behind her. Nora turned, a soft, genuine smile gracing her features. Cedric was dressed simply in dark hunting leathers, his dark hair swept back by the biting wind. Without the crown of Silverfang upon his brow, he looked remarkably at peace. "The roots of the weir oak are incredibly deep, Your Grace," Nora replied softly, her eyes dropping to the newly thawed soil. "It takes far more than one long, bitter winter to kill a truly strong tree." Cedric did not reply immediately. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate strides. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away, his massive, towering frame entirely sheltering her from the harsh northern wind. He reached up, his rough, calloused fingers, hands that had wielded broadswords and broken the jaws of traitors, moving with agonizing gentleness as he tucked a stray, wind-blown lock of dark hair behind her ear. "I am tired of the winter, Nora," Cedric murmured, his luminous golden eyes locking onto hers. They were burning with that familiar, intense, unmasked devotion. But today, there was something deeper, something ancient and primal stirring in their depths. "I am deeply tired of the cold, of the endless, blood-soaked politics, and the echoing empty halls of this keep." Nora's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat against her ribs. The lycanthrope-mate bond was a two-way street of soul-deep magic, and for weeks she had felt the undeniable, magnetic pull of it. It was a force drawing her very spirit to his, demanding she close the gap. But the deep-seated scars of her past, the ingrained terror of being a hunted, hidden, expendable thing, made her hesitate. "I am a scullery maid, Cedric," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she used his given name for the very first time. The sound of it on her lips made the king's eyes flare brighter. "I have no noble bloodlines. I have no armies, no alliances, and no dowry to offer a king. If you claim me, the lords of the outer territories will call you mad. They will say the crown has weakened." "Let them say what they will," Cedric replied instantly, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that sent shivers racing down her spine. Both of his hands came down to gently cup her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "A crown is just a heavy piece of metal, Nora. Bloodlines are just dried ink in dusty, forgotten ledgers. You bled for my son. You faced my lethal wrath in the snow without flinching. You threw yourself over a poisoned cup to save a child that was not born of your body. You brought the sun back into this miserable, shadowed kingdom." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead firmly against hers, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate whisper that resonated within her very bones. "You are my mate. The moon goddess herself could not have forged a better, fiercer queen for Silverfang if she had spent 1,000 years trying. Rule this kingdom with me, Nora. Let me protect you, as fiercely and completely as you protected my boy." Tears, hot, fast, and profoundly healing, spilled over Nora's lashes, trailing down her cheeks to wet Cedric's thumbs. The walls of fear and self-doubt that had dictated her survival for 10 long years finally shattered entirely. They crumbled into dust, replaced by an overwhelming, absolute sense of belonging. She didn't need to mask her scent with ash and lye ever again. She let it bloom, wild and unrestrained. The heavy, intoxicating fragrance of sun-warmed honeysuckle and sweet milk wrapped around them both, a pure, biological manifestation of her love, acceptance, and surrender. She reached up, her small hands, one perfectly smooth, one bearing the jagged, silvery scar of her sacrifice, resting over his massive ones. "Yes," she breathed into the space between them. "Yes, my king." 6 months later, the Silverfang kingdom witnessed a royal coronation unlike any other recorded in the vast, sprawling histories of the lycanthrope world. The heavy oak doors of the great hall were thrown wide open to the public, welcoming not just the high-born lords and ladies in their silks, but the common merchants, the guards, and the servants of the lower keep. The brilliant late summer sunlight streamed through the newly repaired stained glass windows, illuminating the raised dais in a kaleidoscope of vibrant color. Nora didn't kneel to receive a crown of heavy, suffocating gold and ostentatious jewels. By King Cedric's specific, unyielding command, the royal blacksmiths had spent weeks forging a delicate, breathtakingly intricate diadem of pure silver. It was masterfully shaped to mimic the intertwining, reaching vines of wild honeysuckle, interwoven with the tough, enduring, jagged leaves of the winter frost root. As the high priest of the moon goddess stepped forward and gently placed the silver crown upon her dark hair, the packed hall did not politely golf clap. The crowd erupted into a deafening, thunderous roar of genuine cheers that shook the very foundations of the ancient castle. King Cedric stood tall and proud beside her, his massive hand firmly holding hers, his alpha aura radiating nothing but absolute pride, lethal protection, and a profound, unbreakable peace. And standing right between them, dressed in a miniature royal tunic of deep blue velvet, was Prince Leo. The boy looked up at Nora, his silver eyes bright, clear, and utterly devoid of the feral terror that had once consumed him. He squeezed her scarred hand tightly, offering her a brilliant, missing-tooth smile. History would eventually write many grand, sweeping epics about the Silverfang Kingdom. The scholars would document the wars won, the treaties signed, and the trade routes established. But the truest fact, the absolute core of the kingdom's golden age, was the story whispered among the common folk for generations to come. The greatest, most beloved queen the North ever saw was not forged in a rival castle, nor bought with a king's ransom. She was found in the ashes of the kitchens, armed with absolutely nothing but a mother's fierce, unbreakable heart. The story of King Cedric and Queen Nora serves as a powerful testament to the enduring strength found in the most unexpected places. It strips away the illusion that power is solely derived from birthright, wealth, or aggression, revealing that true authority is often rooted in empathy, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Nora's journey from a terrified, hidden Omega to the sovereign heart of a kingdom reminds us that the titles society forces upon us do not dictate our worth. In the end, the feral prince was not saved by a sword, and the broken king was not healed by a treaty. They were rescued by a woman who simply refused to let the cold win. Her legacy proves that compassion is the fiercest magic of all, capable of breaking the darkest curses and forging empires out of ashes.